All right, buckle up because this deep dive is going to be a wild one.
Oh, I'm ready. Let's do it.
We got this document, Bisher bedevinin yahveleri 512 and it really doesn't hold back when it comes to the origins of Islam.
Really? Like what?
Well, right off the bat, it suggests that our traditional understanding of Allah might actually be connected to pre-Islamic Arabian beliefs, which is a pretty bold claim.
Wow, that's going way back.
It is, but to get that, we kind of have to rewind a bit ourselves, right?
Yeah, for sure. So before Islam came along, you had this incredibly diverse polytheistic society in Arabia. Gods and goddesses everywhere, each with their own thing going on.
A whole pantheon. Okay, I'm with you.
Right. It was a whole scene. But here's the kicker. One of the deities they worshipped, yep, you guessed it, Allah.
Hold on, so the name wasn't totally new to them when Islam started?
Not at all. But here's the big difference. This pre-Islamic Allah wasn't seen as the one and only God. More like one powerful deity among many, kind of like in those Greek myths and all.
Okay, so that does change things a bit.
Totally. And that's where this document really gets going. It argues that this whole existing belief system, with Allah already in the mix, could have had a huge impact on how Islam developed.
Especially when it comes to the Quran's emphasis on there only being one God, right?
Exactly. It makes you think about that transition going from a whole bunch of gods to a single all-powerful one. Like, how did that really play out in those early days? Because it wasn't always just Allah.
So how does the document back that up?
Well, it doesn't just stop at the name. It actually points to specific verses in the Quran, like Enam 109, Enam 136, Zumar 3, Yunus 18. The author claims these verses could suggest early Muslims were still kind of dabbling in practices similar to their pagan neighbors.
You mean like worshiping other deities even after accepting Allah?
Potentially. I mean, that's definitely one way to read it.
So we're not talking about a simple, oh, this verse says this, end of story kind of thing.
No way. We're wading straight into the murky waters of interpretation here, and trust me, it's an area with a whole lot of debate. Because within Islamic scholarship, those verses we mentioned, they've got well-established explanations that fit perfectly fine within monotheism.
Okay, so how do scholars explain those verses then, if not as worshiping other gods?
Well, some argue those verses are actually talking about the beliefs of those who did worship other gods, not telling people to do it themselves.
So it's all about how you interpret it, like the context of the words.
That's a huge part of it. And it's what makes exploring these religious texts so interesting. You're not going to find one right answer. It's more about peeling back the layers of meaning, looking at the nuances, the historical context, all of it.
It's like detective work almost. You got to investigate.
Exactly. You got to ask the questions. How do we even approach these sacred texts? How have people interpreted them throughout history, and how have those interpretations maybe changed? It's fascinating.
So we're seeing how even looking at individual verses in the Quran can really shake things up. But this document doesn't stop there. It dives into another layer.
Oh, this is where it gets even juicier, right?
Totally. The document starts looking at how Allah is actually described in the Quran. Specifically, those verses that give Allah like human-like qualities.
The anthropomorphic descriptions.
Oh.
We're going there. Yeah, the document really focuses on those.
It does. Like, it highlights where Allah is described as having hands or legs, even sitting on a throne.
Right. And it makes the point that these descriptions, they seem to clash with this idea of God as this abstract being, something you see in a lot of monotheistic traditions.
Right. It's not just a passing comment either. The document brings it up to say, hey, maybe this contradicts the traditional image of Allah.
And this, my friend, is where the whole concept of ta'wil comes in.
Ta'wil. Break that down for me.
So basically, ta'wil is interpreting these verses, not literally, but metaphorically. You're looking for the symbolic meaning.
So when the Quran talks about Allah's hand, we're not talking about an actual physical hand.
Not quite. It's often interpreted as God's power, as authority, something humans can grasp. It's like using a metaphor to explain a really complex idea.
So it's more about conveying the message in a way people at the time would understand.
Exactly. But this also brings up a huge question for anyone dealing with religious texts. How much does interpretation actually shape our understanding? Could two people read the same verse and walk away with completely different ideas?
Right. It shows that meaning isn't always set in stone. And speaking of interpretations, this document also brings in the hadiths, those sayings and stories about the Prophet Muhammad.
Oh yeah, the hadiths add another whole level of complexity to this. There's still debate about how literally we should take them. Some Muslims interpret them literally, but others see them more metaphorically. especially when they describe Allah in physical terms.
Which I'm guessing doesn't always line up with that idea of Allah as this abstract being we were talking about.
Exactly. And it all comes down to different schools of thought within Islam and how much weight they place on the hadiths compared to the Quran.
So how do they decide?
Well, some branches prioritize the Quran above everything else. Then you've got others who see the Quran and the hadiths as going hand in hand, both important. And of course, Islamic scholars have spent centuries developing ways to verify hadiths, figuring out which ones are authentic and which ones are maybe not so reliable. It's a whole other deep dive in itself, honestly.
It really makes you realize how much goes into understanding these texts. But getting back to this document and its critique, it's interesting because it doesn't just stop at these big theological debates about Allah. So this document, it doesn't just tackle these big theological questions about Allah, it also goes there into some pretty sensitive territory.
Right. It calls out some moral and historical parts of Islamic tradition that are, let's be honest, difficult to wrestle with.
Yeah, like it doesn't hold back on things. For instance, it brings up the whole conquest of the Turkic peoples as like a prime example of violence being used in the name of Islam. And it gets into the nitty-gritty too, talking about forced conversions, communities being displaced, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, it paints a pretty stark picture, doesn't it?
It really does, and it kind of makes you question that whole narrative of Islam spreading peacefully.
You know, it's true. That period was definitely marked by violence and conflict. No way around it. But here's the thing. It's tough to judge historical events purely through a modern lens, you know. What we might see as totally wrong now, we have to try to understand it in the context of the time.
So we can't just look at it through our 21st century glasses and go bad, bad, bad.
Exactly. We have to ask different questions, like what were the rules of war back then? What was considered acceptable? And how did those power dynamics of the time influence how things went down?
It's like trying to understand a whole different world.
Exactly. And, you know, this period in Islamic history, it wasn't unique in its violence. Empires throughout history, they've expanded through conquest. The real challenge for us is trying to understand this particular piece within the bigger story of Islam, looking at all the different perspectives, the different interpretations.
So it's more about understanding than judging.
You got it. History is rarely black and white. Lots of gray areas. And with all this talk about interpretations and different views, this document circles back to a really big question. If the Quran is supposed to be the literal word of God, perfect in every way, how do you reconcile that with, well, stuff that seems to contradict that? Like, how can a perfect God say or do things that seem less than perfect or change his mind?
Especially if it's supposed to be unchanging,
Yeah.
personally.
This document brings up nask, the idea that some verses in the Quran actually replace earlier ones.
It's like a divine edit.
Kinda. And that makes you think, is the Quran really unchanging then? And then there's those missing verses, the ones people say got lost or whatever. Makes you wonder, can something be perfect if it's incomplete?
Those are tough questions.
They really are. And they get to the heart of how we interpret religious texts. Traditional Islamic scholars, they'd say things like, nask actually show God's wisdom, not imperfection. That he reveals his will gradually because he understands human limitations.
So it's about understanding these things within the framework of faith.
Right. It's about realizing that there are always different ways to interpret things, and those interpretations, they've changed throughout history. How you make sense of those apparent contradictions depends on your own beliefs and how you approach religious texts.
It's a lot to chew on, that's for sure. This deep dive has taken us everywhere.
Yeah.
What really stands out to you after looking at all this?
I think the biggest thing I'm left with is how important it is to ask these challenging questions. How powerful it is to look at things from different angles. That's what makes us think critically and keeps the conversation going.
Absolutely. Don't shy away from those tough questions. Keep them coming and keep digging for those answers. That's what we're all about here on The Deep Dive. Until next time.